Chapter 1. The Garden Party and the Silver Teapot. The village of St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on its peaceful charm. Nestled between rolling green hills and cobbled streets, it was a place where change came slowly, and scandal arrived in whispers over afternoon tea. On this particular afternoon, however, there was no talk of scandal, only excited chatter, as the annual summer garden party was in full swing on the expansive lawn of the elegant Hadley Manor. Miss Marple, sitting primly in a shaded corner with a fine china cup of tea in hand, observed the scene with quiet amusement. The women in pastel dresses and wide-brimmed hats bustled about, exchanging pleasantries, while the men, in light summer suits, discussed everything from cricket scores to the latest misfortunes of a neighbouring village. At the heart of the gathering stood Lady Eleanor Hadley, a woman of formidable presence, her silver-streaked hair pinned neatly, a regal air about her despite the oppressive heat. Her prized possession, a centuries-old silver teapot, gleamed under the sunlight on a beautifully arranged refreshment table. It was a family heirloom, once owned by her great-grandmother, and every year it made its appearance at the garden party as a symbol of tradition. But as Miss Marple took another sip of her tea, a sharp cry rang through the air. "Good heavens! The silver teapot! It's gone!" The gathered guests turned in unison to see Mrs. Clarissa Fenton, Lady Hadley's closest friend, staring in horror at the empty space where the teapot had stood just moments ago. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Theft here in St. Mary Mead? It was almost unthinkable. Miss Marple set down her teacup, her sharp blue eyes twinkling with curiosity. A stolen teapot might not be a murder, but experience had taught her that small crimes often led to greater ones. And so, as the whispers of suspicion and gossip began to spread through the gathering, Miss Marple simply watched, observed, because, more often than not, it was the little things, the seemingly unimportant details that solved the greatest mysteries. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By the time the last guest had left Hadley Manor, St. Mary Mead was already buzzing with whispers. A theft at Lady Hadley's garden party? And the precious silver teapot, no less. It was scandalous. The kind of thing that sent ripples through the village like a stone dropped into a still pond. At the Rose and Crown, the local pub, speculation ran rampant. Colonel Archibald Graves, a retired military man with a fondness for the sound of his own voice, slammed his pint on the wooden counter. "Mark my words, it's those drifters passing through town. Always up to no good," he declared, nodding to a few murmured agreements. "This used to be a decent village. Now we've got outsiders who can't keep their hands to themselves." "Rubbish!" scoffed Mrs. Perkins, the postmistress, adjusting her spectacles. "No outsider would even know about that teapot. This is an inside job. Someone at that party took it." At that moment, Reverend Leonard Phelps, a mild-mannered man who preferred peace over gossip, cleared his throat. "Perhaps it was simply misplaced," he suggested. "There's no need to assume wrongdoing just yet." Mrs. Perkins snorted. "Oh, Reverend, don't be naive. A thing like that doesn't just vanish." Meanwhile, at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting with a practised rhythm, her mind ticking away like a well-oiled clock. "An inside job," she mused to herself. recalling the exact moment when the teapot had disappeared. There had been no rush, no dramatic commotion, just a quiet shift, a missing object, and a rising tide of unease. And then there was Lady Hadley's reaction. She had been too composed, not distraught, not angry, merely thoughtful. Outside, the village gossips were sharpening their theories, throwing names into the air like confetti. Some whispered about Lady Hadley's nephew Julian, a young man known for his extravagant habits. Others suspected Mrs. Clarissa Fenton, her long-time friend, who had been closest to the teapot when it disappeared. Miss Marple simply listened, observed, because she knew, better than anyone, that when people were busy talking, they often revealed far more than they intended to. Chapter 3. The Early Investigation. The next morning, Lady Eleanor Hadley sat in her drawing-room, composed but noticeably preoccupied. The events of the garden party still lingered in the air, like the scent of fresh roses that decorated her mantle. The silver teapot, a prized family heirloom, had vanished, and with it the village's sense of security. Miss Marple, who had been invited for tea, sans the stolen teapot, of course, sat across from Lady Hadley, her hands delicately folded in her lap. "My dear Lady Hadley, I do hope the distress of yesterday has not unsettled you too much," Miss Marple said gently. Lady Hadley sighed, smoothing out the fine lace handkerchief in her lap. "It is rather a nuisance, Miss Marple. A senseless act, truly. But the police have already taken statements. I am certain they will recover the teapot soon enough." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. One always hopes for a swift resolution. It was then that Inspector Harold Crayford was announced, a tall, sturdy man with the air of someone who had seen far too many petty crimes. He nodded politely to the ladies before taking a seat. "Well, Lady Hadley," he began, flipping through his notebook, "I've spoken to several guests. No one saw anything suspicious, only that the teapot was there one moment and gone the next. We'll conduct a search in case it was misplaced, but—" He hesitated, then looked directly at Lady Hadley. "You're quite sure it was stolen?" Lady Hadley stiffened. "Inspector, I am not prone to bouts of forgetfulness. That teapot was taken, there is no doubt." Miss Marple sipped her tea. The exchange was intriguing. She watched Lady Hadley closely. Her reaction, so carefully measured, was telling. The inspector continued, "We do have a few names to consider. Your nephew, Julian Hadley." Lady Hadley's teacup clinked sharply against the saucer. "Ridiculous," she said, too quickly. "Julian may be irresponsible at times, but he would never steal from his own family." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her own teacup. A small but important reaction. "And then there's Mrs. Clarissa Fenton," the inspector went on. "She was standing closest to the table." Lady Hadley shook her head. "Clarissa is my dearest friend. She has no need to steal." "But someone did," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. The inspector sighed. "For now, I'd like permission to question the staff." Lady Hadley hesitated. "If you must." As Inspector Crayford made his way out, Miss Marple set down her tea and spoke softly. "A most curious situation, Lady Hadley." Lady Hadley's lips pressed into a thin line. "I dare say you find everything curious, Miss Marple." Miss Marple chuckled. "Oh, yes, I suppose I do." And as she walked out onto the sunlit garden path, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a missing teapot. Something was being hidden, something much darker. Chapter 4. The First Suspect. By noon, the village of St. Mary Mead was brimming with suspicions. As was often the case in such matters, everyone had their own theory, and most were quick to assign blame. Inspector Crayford, true to his methodical nature, had begun questioning those present at the party. A list of likely suspects had emerged, but one name seemed to be on everyone's lips: Julian Hadley. Julian, the late Lord Hadley's wayward nephew, had always been a source of whispered conversations. Though charming, he was known for his extravagant lifestyle, his taste for luxury, and, most damning of all, his considerable gambling debts. At the village green, 2 elderly women were deep in discussion. "I heard he was in London just last month begging for loans," Mrs. Perkins whispered conspiratorially. Mrs. Rogers, the baker's wife, nodded, and I distinctly recall that he was standing very close to the refreshment table when the teapot vanished. It was enough for many to conclude that Julian was the culprit. After all, a man in need of quick money could very well steal a valuable antique and sell it to settle his debts. A meeting with Julian Miss Marple, however, was not one to leap to conclusions. She had seen enough of life to know that the obvious answer was rarely the correct one. She found Julian Hadley in the library of Hadley Manor, staring moodily out the window, a glass of brandy in his hand despite the early hour. When she entered, he turned and forced a smile. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Come to see the family disgrace." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh no, dear boy. I simply thought a bit of fresh air and conversation might be preferable to brooding." Julian gave a short laugh and gestured for her to sit. "So, you've heard the gossip, I presume?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "People will always talk, but I prefer to listen." Julian swirled his brandy. "Well then, listen to this. I did not steal the teapot. Do I have debts? Certainly. But I'd hardly be fool enough to steal from my own aunt in front of half the village." Miss Marple observed him keenly. "And yet you left the party quite early." His fingers tightened around the glass. "Because I had a meeting in London. I caught the last train." "How very convenient." Julian's jaw clenched. "If you think I did it, then you're wasting your time, Miss Marple. The police already checked my bags, my rooms, nothing." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Oh, I never think. I only observe." Something in Julian's expression flickered. A moment of hesitation, a slight shift in his demeanour. It was not the look of a guilty man, but it was the look of a man hiding something. Miss Marple remains unconvinced. That evening, Inspector Crayford declared Julian Hadley the prime suspect. Lady Hadley, though distressed, could not refute the mounting evidence against him. Yet, as Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting and reflecting, she could not shake the feeling that it was all too easy. A stolen teapot was one thing, but if someone had gone to such lengths to make Julian look guilty, then what exactly was being covered up? And more importantly, was this crime just the beginning? Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue, the Village of St. Mary. Mead settled into an uneasy hush as Julian Hadley remained the prime suspect. Some found the idea deliciously scandalous, while others shook their heads. believing the matter far from resolved. Miss Marple, as always, preferred facts over gossip, and something about this case simply did not sit right with her. A late-night revelation. It was well past dusk when Miss Marple sat in her small cosy cottage, knitting in the glow of her reading lamp. She replayed the events of the garden party, in her mind, step by step. The teapot was there. Then, suddenly, it was not. But something was bothering her. Something small, almost insignificant, yet deeply troubling. She reached for her handbag and withdrew a small handkerchief, dabbing at her forehead. And then she froze. Her eyes widened as she stared at the delicate white fabric. A monogram. Something about it clicked. Quickly, she rose, reached for her coat, and made her way toward Hadley Manor. Clue overlooked Lady Hadley, though surprised by her late visit, welcomed her into the drawing-room. "My dear Miss Marple, I must say I had not expected visitors at this hour." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Forgive me, Lady Hadley, but I simply could not rest. There is something I wished to confirm." She gestured toward the silver serving tray, still resting on the sideboard where the refreshments had been served that fateful afternoon. "Tell me, Lady Hadley, when the teapot went missing, was anything else out of place?" Lady Hadley frowned. "No, I don't believe so. The cups, the sugar bowl, the spoons, everything was left untouched." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And yet, this tray was polished just before the party, was it not?" Lady Hadley nodded, puzzled. Miss Marple bent down, examining the surface under the lamp. She ran a finger lightly over the metal and smiled. "Ah, just as I thought." Lady Hadley leaned forward. "Miss Marple, what are you suggesting?" Marple straightened, holding out her handkerchief. "This tray, dear Lady Hadley, should have fingerprints. Yet it does not. Someone wiped it clean." Lady Hadley gasped. "A person who steals in haste does not stop to clean their prints." "But a person who wants to frame someone else? Well, that is another matter entirely." There was a sharp silence between them. Then slowly Miss Marple added, "I believe, Lady Hadley, that the teapot was not the true prize." Lady Hadley's face paled. Miss Marple watched her reaction carefully. Yes, she thought, there is more to this than just a missing teapot, and, if she was right, then they were nowhere near the real crime. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was crisp, yet there was an undeniable weight of unease hanging over the village. Whispers of Julian Hadley's supposed guilt filled the air. But Miss Marple had seen enough in her years to know that truth was often buried beneath layers of deception. And deception, she suspected, was at the very heart of this missing teapot affair. A question for Mrs. Clarissa. Fenton, Miss Marple's first stop, was the home of Mrs. Clarissa Fenton, Lady Hadley's dearest friend, and the woman who had been closest to the teapot when it vanished. Clarissa, a stately woman in her early 60s, greeted Miss Marple with polite curiosity. "Oh, Miss Marple, I must say, this whole affair has been terribly distressing. To think, a theft at Eleanor's party! And poor Julian, caught in the middle of it all." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers lightly adjusting her handbag. "Yes, quite a tragedy. though you were standing very near the refreshment table when it happened, were you not?" Clarissa's lips parted slightly before she gave a tight-lipped smile. "Well, yes, but I hardly saw anything." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, "And yet I do wonder who was standing nearest to Lady Hadley when she discovered the theft." Clarissa hesitated for just a moment too long. "Why, I suppose I was." Miss Marple tilted her head. "How curious." Clarissa shifted uncomfortably. "You surely don't mean to suggest—" "Oh, not at all, dear," Miss Marple interrupted, with a pleasant smile. "I simply find it interesting that, in all the commotion, you were the first to announce the theft." Clarissa's face stiffened. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's voice remained light, almost conversational, only that I've often found that the person who first calls attention to a crime sometimes knows more than they let on. Clarissa exhaled sharply. "Miss Marple, this is absurd." But Miss Marple only nodded. "Perhaps, or perhaps, dear Mrs. Fenton, you saw something that you have yet to mention." Clarissa's expression wavered, and for a brief moment her eyes flickered toward the mantelpiece, where a collection of delicate silver trinkets gleamed in the light. Miss Marple followed her gaze and smiled to herself. A tense conversation with Lady Hadley that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Hadley Manor, where Lady Hadley was pacing, in her drawing-room. The usually composed woman looked restless, her gloved fingers twitching as she poured tea. "Miss Marple," she said briskly, "I have heard from Clarissa. She was quite unsettled by your visit." Miss Marple, undeterred, accepted her tea. "Ah, well, sometimes difficult questions must be asked." Lady Hadley's teacup clinked sharply against the saucer. "I do hope you are not meddling unnecessarily. The police have already concluded Julian's involvement." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Yes, they have. And yet I cannot help but wonder about something you said." Lady Hadley stiffened. "Oh?" Miss Marple placed her spoon down and looked directly at her hostess. "When the teapot was stolen, you did not appear shocked. Surprised, yes, but not shocked." Lady Hadley's lips pressed together. "And what, pray, does that signify?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "It tells me, dear Lady Hadley, that you already knew that something was amiss." The room fell into a charged silence. For the first time Lady Hadley looked uncertain, and that, more than anything, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. The theft of the teapot had been a distraction. The real crime had yet to reveal itself, and Lady Hadley knew exactly what it was. Chapter 7. Another twist. The village of St. Mary Mead was still abuzz with talk of the missing silver teapot and the scandals surrounding Julian Hadley. But Miss Marple sensed that something far more serious was brewing beneath the surface. Her suspicions were confirmed when, just before dawn, a loud commotion erupted at Hadley Manor. A maid, breathless and trembling, had come running from the great house, her voice shrill with panic as she banged on the door of Dr. Edward Graves, the village physician. "There's been an accident," she gasped. "Lady Hadley, she's been found unconscious in her room. A shocking development." By the time Miss Marple arrived at Hadley Manor, the house was in chaos. Servants whispered in hushed tones the police had been summoned, and Inspector Crayford was already questioning the butler, Mr. Pritchard, in the hallway. She was found on the floor beside her writing desk, Mr. Pritchard was explaining. I heard a crash in the night, but I thought nothing of it until the maid went to wake her this morning. Inspector Crayford turned to Dr. Graves? What's her condition? The doctor, a serious man with sharp eyes, shook his head. She's stable for now, but she suffered a blow to the head. It could have been from the fall, but... He trailed off meaningfully. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the room, cleared her throat. Or it could have been something more sinister. The inspector sighed. And what, Miss Marple, do you suspect this time? Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, her sharp eyes noticing something the others had overlooked. A small overturned inkwell on Lady Hadley's desk, the black stain spreading across a piece of parchment. She took a step closer. The ink had smeared, but beneath it she could make out the edges of handwriting. And then she saw something even more troubling. A tiny silver object, half hidden under the writing desk. Miss Marple bent down and retrieved it, a silver teaspoon. She turned it over in her palm, her thoughts racing. The teapot had disappeared, but the teaspoons remained. That meant the thief hadn't stolen for the value of the silver. The theft had been a distraction, a way to divert attention. And now Lady Hadley had been attacked. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. Someone had wanted something from Lady Hadley's desk, something important enough to kill for. A conversation with Julian. An hour later, Miss Marple found Julian Hadley standing at the edge of the rose garden, his face pale, a cigarette shaking between his fingers. When he saw her approach, he exhaled sharply. I suppose you're here to tell me I'm guilty of this too. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Not at all, dear boy, but I do wonder, do you know of anything your aunt might have been hiding? Julian hesitated. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Then he said very quietly, my aunt was keeping a secret, and I think someone tried to kill her for it. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the silver teaspoon in her pocket. She had a feeling Julian was right, and if she didn't act fast, the next attack might be fatal. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. Miss Marple had seen many crimes in her time, but this one was growing more dangerous by the hour. A stolen silver teapot, a suspiciously wiped tray, a hidden document, and now an attack on Lady Hadley. It all pointed to a larger scheme, and Miss Marple had a feeling that the real villain was beginning to feel desperate. It was time to set a trap. The perfect bait. Late that evening, Miss Marple paid another visit to Hadley Manor. Lady Hadley, though weak, had regained consciousness, but she was too frightened to say much. Miss Marple reassured her that everything would be handled. Then she made a quiet request to the butler, Mr. Pritchard. Be sure to mention loudly that Lady Hadley has recovered enough to continue writing her letter, she instructed. Mr. Pritchard blinked. But, madam, she has not... Miss Marple smiled gently. Yes, dear, I know, but I do believe someone would be very interested to hear otherwise. And so, as the evening deepened and the house settled into an uneasy hush, Miss Marple waited. A shadow in the night at precisely midnight, Miss Marple, hidden in the corner of the library, heard the sound she had been waiting for. A soft creak as the study door opened, a cautious footstep on the polished wooden floor. Then In the dim glow of the moonlight, she saw it, a shadow moving towards Lady Hadley's desk. A gloved hand reached for the stack of papers, and at that precise moment, click! The lamps flared to life, illuminating the stunned figure in the centre of the room. Miss Marple sat calmly in her chair, her knitting needles clicking together. "Ah," she said pleasantly, "I thought it might be you." The intruder froze, and then slowly Clarissa Fenton lowered her hand, her face ashen, the truth revealed, the study door burst open, and Inspector Crayford strode in, flanked by 2 constables. Clarissa's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is absurd." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I don't think so, dear. You see, I have been thinking, why steal a teapot? Such an odd crime, unless the value of the object wasn't the point at all." Clarissa's fingers twitched. Miss Marple continued, her voice light but unyielding. "And then there was the matter of the cleaned tray. The teapot wasn't just taken, it was taken to remove evidence. Something had been hidden inside, something Lady Hadley was writing about. And that, my dear, is what you truly wanted." Clarissa scoffed. "You have no proof." Miss Marple shook her head, her voice turning cold. "You attacked Lady Hadley because she discovered your secret. And when I mentioned the letter, you couldn't resist coming back to destroy the evidence." Inspector Crayford stepped forward. "We found the stolen teapot in your house, Mrs. Fenton, polished clean but still holding traces of ink inside." Clarissa's face drained of all colour, and Miss Marple delivered the final blow. "I believe," she said softly, "that inside that teapot Lady Hadley had hidden something very precious, a will, one that changed everything." Clarissa staggered backward, her hands trembling, and then, finally, she broke. "Yes," she spat. "I took it. Eleanor was going to change her will, cutting me out, giving everything to that useless nephew of hers, after all I did for her." Miss Marple shook her head sadly. "And so you tried to destroy the proof, but you made one fatal mistake." Clarissa's breath hitched. "What?" Miss Marple smiled. "You forgot that I never miss a detail. The case is closed." By dawn, Clarissa Fenton had been arrested, and Lady Hadley, now safe, had confirmed everything. The missing teapot, the altered will, the murder attempt, all part of a desperate bid to secure an inheritance that was never rightfully hers. As Miss Marple sipped her morning tea, Inspector Crayford sighed. "I suppose I should stop being surprised when you solve these cases before me." Miss Marple chuckled. "Oh, Inspector, I do believe you'll catch on one day." And with that, she picked up her knitting, content, once again, that justice had prevailed. Chapter 9. The reveal, the village of St. Mary Mead awoke to the news of Clarissa Fenton's arrest. The gossips at the Rose and Crown wasted no time spinning theories, while others simply shook their heads in astonishment. A teapot theft that led to an attempted murder, Mrs. Perkins murmured, stirring her tea. "Only in our dear village." But the true unravelling of the mystery occurred at Hadley Manor, where Inspector Crayford, Julian Hadley, and Lady Hadley gathered in the drawing-room, all eyes on Miss Marple. She sat serenely, knitting in hand, before finally setting it down and beginning her explanation. A crime born from greed. Miss Marple folded her hands. "From the beginning, something about the theft of the teapot troubled me. It seemed so unnecessary. Julian frowned. Unnecessary? Miss Marple nodded. A silver teapot is valuable, certainly, but not valuable enough to risk stealing in a crowded garden party. It was too bold, too public, which meant it was never about the teapot itself. Lady Hadley inhaled sharply. It was about what was inside. Miss Marple smiled. Precisely. When I noticed the wiped tray, I realized the thief was careful about something other than fingerprints. The tray was polished after the theft, which suggested that something had been removed from inside the teapot. Something made of paper. Inspector Crayford nodded. The missing will. Miss Marple turned to Lady Hadley. You had recently begun rewriting your will, had you not? Lady Hadley hesitated, then sighed. Yes, Clarissa. She had always assumed she would be my primary beneficiary, but I had changed my mind. Julian, she turned to her nephew. I had decided to leave everything to you. Julian's expression flickered with shock. I didn't know. Miss Marple continued. Clarissa did, however. She had been helping you manage some of your affairs, had she not? Lady Hadley nodded grimly. Yes, she had access to my documents. Miss Marple pressed on. When Clarissa realized she was about to be disinherited, she needed to act quickly. She knew you always kept your most private papers hidden in your silver teapot, a detail she would have learned from being your closest friend for years. Hadley looked down, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple went on, her voice gentle yet firm. So, she waited for the garden party, the perfect distraction, and quietly stole the teapot, knowing that everyone would assume it was a simple theft. Then, later that evening, she burned the will. Julian exhaled sharply. And when my aunt realized what had happened, Clarissa attacked her to keep the secret safe. Miss Marple gave a small nod. That was her second mistake. The first, of course, was underestimating how many small things can give a person away. The fatal mistakes, Inspector Crayford sighed. And what were those mistakes, Miss Marple? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, quite a few. First, there was her reaction. Clarissa was the first to shout about the missing teapot, which, as I have often found, is a habit of those who want to control the narrative. Lady Hadley closed her eyes in realization. Miss Marple continued. Then there was the fact that the teapot was missing, but the teaspoons remained. A thief interested in silver would have taken the entire set, but Clarissa only wanted one thing, the will inside. Inspector Crayford nodded, and then she made the final mistake, coming back to steal the rewritten version. Miss Marple chuckled. Ah, yes. She assumed Lady Hadley had begun rewriting her will again after the first was destroyed. When I let it slip that she had continued writing, Clarissa panicked and came back to finish the job. But by then, we were waiting for her. Julian shook his head. It was never about me, was it? She didn't care who inherited the money. She only cared that it wasn't taken away from her. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. Indeed, greed, dear boy, makes people do desperate things. Justice and reflection Clarissa Fenton's arrest left the village shaken. But Miss Marple had little time for gloating. As always, she simply sat back, sipping her tea, and let the world return to normal. Inspector Crayford sighed. I suppose I'll have to start paying more attention to the little things. Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, Inspector, the little things are often the most important." Lady Hadley placed a hand on Julian's. "Perhaps this is a fresh start," and Miss Marple, wise as ever, simply watched, because human nature was, and always would be, the greatest mystery of all. Chapter 10. Aftermath. With Clarissa Fenton behind bars, the village of St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its usual rhythms of polite gossip and quiet scandals. Yet there was something different in the air, a lingering unease that only came after the revelation of a hidden darkness. Hadley Manor, once a symbol of stability and tradition, now carried the whispers of betrayal and attempted murder. Lady Hadley, though recovering well, had taken to spending more time alone in her study. The reality of her closest friend's treachery was something she could not easily forget. Miss Marple, however, understood something very important. Life moves on, even after the most dreadful of crimes. A walk through the village on a brisk morning, Miss Marple took her usual stroll through the village, stopping at the Rose and Crown for a quiet cup of tea. The moment she stepped inside, she was greeted by Mrs. Perkins and Mrs. Rogers, who were deep in discussion, as always. "Oh, Miss Marple, dear," Mrs. Perkins said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Isn't it just awful? A woman like Clarissa, one of Lady Hadley's oldest friends. If one can't trust an old friend, who can one trust?" Mrs. Rogers nodded sagely, "And all over a bit of money. Shocking, truly shocking." Miss Marple, stirring her tea, gave a thoughtful hum. "Oh, yes, my dears, but then one must remember, money is never just about money. It is about control, power, fear of being forgotten. Quite dreadful, really." Snidew. Mrs. Perkins sighed dramatically. "I suppose that's why you're always so clever, Miss Marple. You understand people too well." Miss Marple smiled, taking a delicate sip of her tea. "Oh, my dear, people are rather predictable once you've seen enough of them." And with that, she rose, adjusted her gloves, and left at the cosy warmth of the tea shop, stepping back into the crisp autumn air. A final conversation with Lady Hadley. A few days later, Miss Marple was invited to Hadley Manor for one last visit before Lady Hadley was set to travel abroad for a much-needed rest. The two women sat in the drawing-room, the sunlight casting soft golden patterns on the floor. "I must thank you, Miss Marple," Lady Hadley said, her voice gentler than usual. "Without you, I might never have known the truth." Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. "Oh, my dear, I only helped shine a light on what was already there. You would have seen it in time." Lady Hadley exhaled. "It's strange, isn't it, how people can wear such masks? I thought I knew Clarissa better than anyone." Miss Marple's expression softened. "We often see only what people allow us to see. But the truth, my dear, always has a way of revealing itself." Lady Hadley smiled faintly. "And what will you do now?" Miss Marple chuckled, picking up her knitting. "Oh, my dear, I suspect there will always be another mystery waiting just around the corner." Lady Hadley laughed. A real, genuine laugh this time. "Indeed, Miss Marple, indeed. Justice, closure, and the next mystery." As autumn faded into winter, the case of the silver teapot became just another story, retold in hushed voices over tea and biscuits. Julian Hadley settled into his new role as heir to the estate, vowing to, be more responsible than he had been before. Lady Hadley, though forever changed, left for a quiet retreat in the south of France, where she could finally breathe freely again. And Miss Marple, she simply returned to her modest little cottage, where the fireplace crackled warmly and her knitting needles clicked away. Because in St. Mary Mead there would always be another crime, another scandal, another secret lurking just beneath the surface, and Miss Marple would always be watching the end.